Welcome everybody again to this summer course on strengthening European identity through culture and education and how to manage it. We have for the opening lecture, and it's a pleasure for me an honor to present him, Professor Abram de Swaan. He's a member of the European and Ibero-American Academy of Yuste Foundation, has been professor of social science at the University of Amsterdam since 1973. He's member of the governing board of the Centre d'études des Relations Internationales, de l'École des Sciences Politiques de Paris, as well as a board member of several research centers at the University of Amsterdam. He's a correspondent member of the board of numerous foreign professional journals, and in 2006 he was condecorated as a Knight in the Order of a Lion of the Netherlands. In May, he received the National Award for Literature. I must say he's a very active writer. He's now working in a new book that will be published hopefully next year. And well, I invite you to read his curriculum because it's very, very long, and maybe I cannot take time from him for his speech. So Professor Abram de Swaan has been also director of the Academy of Yuste, and has been working with us in many projects, and especially on the field of European identity. And I think he's going to focus also his speech in this topic. So Professor, you are very welcome. We are very honored to have you here, and the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm very glad to be here, thanks to the organizers of the Cultural Business Academy and the Academia Europea e Iberoamericana de Yuste. And now let's get to work. I want to stick a little bit to the title of this course, which is about European identity and how to strengthen it and how to manage it. And that, of course, is even more ambitious than establishing in 30 months a new academy, which, as I will point out, may be, well, one of the most central projects in the effort to create a European identity. And I want to start with a quotation from Pierre Bourdieu, a famous French sociologist. And when sociologists get famous, they're always called philosophers. I don't know why. And of course, he did his training in philosophy. Bourdieu said in French, you remember that language? French. They speak it in France and nowhere else. That's the problem. Anyway, on croit souvent que la vie intellectuelle est spontanément internationale. Rien n'est plus faux. So it's often believed that intellectual life is of itself spontaneously international. Nothing could be more wrong. To internationalize culture and intellectual life is hard work. It requires an effort, and it requires the right conditions. Now, that is what I want to talk with you about this morning. First of all, I want to give a little characterization of what this European Union is, because we're living in a unique historical transition, and we can't quite be sure which way the transition will go, of integration of nation states to an even higher level of integration into something for which we haven't really a word. I would say China belongs in that category, India belongs in that category, the United States belong in that category, and the Soviet Empire belonged in that category. I call them the giants. They're one category, one order of magnitude greater, larger, I should say, than nation states. And I'll return to that theme. But in the past 60 years, a peculiar political construct has emerged from a combination of European states. The European Union is more than a confederation, but it's less than a federation. It's more than just a free trade zone, but it's not quite an economic whole. It's almost a world power, but one without an army or an effective foreign policy of its own. It has a common currency, the euro, but with coins that reserve a different verso for each member state. So the euro here is different from the euro in the Netherlands. And quite often you get in Germany a euro from Italy, which is very interesting. Somebody should count the circulation of those coins. And yet, taken together in less than a lifetime, by the way, my lifetime, these are major achievements. And the ambitions were at some time even more grandiose, ever eastwards. The Union, after expanding into Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltic, one day might well come to include all of the Balkan. And until a few years ago, there were even fantasies about Turkey, Ukraine, Georgia, and Russia. We have become a little bit more modest and a little bit more realistic. Maybe the European Union is becoming adults. And this geographic extension was to be managed by further political integration. But the constitutional treaty that would have elevated the Union further beyond a sheer regulatory apparatus and closer towards a federal entity was voted down as soon as the voters in several countries, most notably France and the Netherlands, were confronted with the choice. And since then, an uneasy mood has spread among the Europeans, and that has much exacerbated the real malaise. The institutions of the European Union have failed to capture the imagination of the electorate. For this audience, I don't need to enumerate the very complicated and very indirectly democratic institutions of the European Union. But at this present moment, many, if not most, politicians find it very difficult to muster the courage to come to the defense of the European Union, and thus they leave the stage to the loudest screamers, mostly but not always on the nationalist authoritarian right. And the greatest cowards, I hate to say, are many social democratic leaders who simply do not dare speak up for the Union, which almost everybody knows in their heart of hearts they support. And I should say that the most courageous politicians in this respect at present are Angela Merkel and Macron of France, who I would classify in the center or center-right. Now let us look at this Europe. And first of all, I want to talk about public space as an essential element of an integrated political entity, and certainly a democratic political entity. And then I want to speak about identity. And we'll be very critical of that concept. And then I want to look at another concept which is called cultural opportunity structure, the social conditions that may encourage and facilitate or hamper the cultural initiatives. And I took it from another theory which I will mention. So that is what you can prepare to take away from this lecture. Public space in Europe is highly fragmented. Europeans do not speak the same language and hence do not understand each other well enough to agree or differ. But quite apart from the confusion of tongues, opinions everywhere are shaped within different national frameworks. So there are the separations of language and the boundaries of national communities which keep us apart. So what is passionately debated in one country is often not even an issue in adjacent countries. And what is fascinating is that sometimes even neighboring countries which speak the same language, let me take the Netherlands and Flanders, hardly ever communicate and discuss the same agenda. It seems as if when we mention in the Netherlands the word Flanders, we are overcome by a profound sleepishness, and it's very difficult to mobilize any kind of interest. I don't know how things are between Spain and Portugal, who do not speak the same language, or for that matter, France and Belgium, but it is very difficult to create a lively interest in what happens in different countries. I could enumerate, though, a number of issues that did generate an all-European interest. Terrorist attacks, for example. The economic crisis and the handling of the central bank. I'll be sure I won't enumerate them all. And now Brexit. These fascinate everyone in the European Union. Everyone has an opinion about it, and everyone is talking about the same issue at the same time. And you could say that what characterizes a political or cultural community is when they have the same, people there have the same agenda for discussing the same political or cultural issues. So there are certain points in the recent history of Europe where indeed people were talking with each other, and sometimes even discussing across the boundaries of language and across the boundaries of nation. But one of the great specialists, the British communication scientist Philip Schlesinger, said, "The mediated public sphere in the European Union remains first and overwhelmingly national. Second, where it is not national, it is transnational and Anglophone." They speak English there. And it is elitist in class terms. I think that's a very important political issue. Those people who move around in Europe, people like Steve or me, those real Europeans, are considered classy. And people have their misgivings about it. Not about Steve or me or other people present here, but about those whole European jet sets who travels around business class from our tax money. There is an elitist aspect about it. Whether that is justified, I leave to others to decide. Third, so it is not only national, and when it's national, it is transnational and Anglophone. It speaks English. Present company not accepted. But even there, it still decants principally into national modes of address. So Philip Schlesinger coined the term communicative space, a space that is unified in terms of communication. We could say public space, Öffentlichkeit, l'espace public. Now, I think that in order to understand why it is so difficult to have a truly European agenda, and this is very important, European intellectuals and European artists and European politicians, we must talk a little bit about this very thorny subject of identity. First of all, let me say, I consider the term identity a misnomer. Identity, when you think of it, is hard, unchanging. It's like the chain with your little cross, your little Jewish star, or your little hand, Islamic star. on your neck. It won't change. You've got only one. You don't have dangling all these religious or national symbols. It's unchanging. It is has one clear meaning only. It doesn't overlap. Well, we all know that that's not the way. Identities are multiple and changing. But in this sentence, identity is the subject of the sentence. And I propose to make people the subject of the sentence, and to say, let us look at identity, first of all, as a form of action. And second, therefore, of interaction as a social process. So action, interaction, and process. People do something, and what they do is they identify with other people. And sometimes, this is equally important, they disidentify from other people. When people identify with other people, they feel strongly, cognitively, and morally, and emotionally that those other people are similar to them in morally and politically and culturally relevant aspects. That's where it matters, they are similar. And that means that some people must be less similar, they're different in relevant, morally or politically relevant respects. And people tend to disidentify from them. Now we have action and process and social interaction. We're doing things. Moreover, the theory of identification is deeply anchored in early Freudian theory, and since then has been elaborated for the first time in a political sense by Harold Lasswell, and more recently in a psychological sense by Nico Freyda, Dutch psychologist. So there is a lot of theory about what identifying and disidentifying means. What it also means that one can only feel together and identify with one another if there are other people who do not belong. And this is one thing which so often is skipped when we talk about European identity. You cannot just be inclusive. There's always people who are different from us. Not any less in any sense, just different from us. And quite usually that can be unpleasant and disagreeable. Sometimes it is, there are even toxic ways of disidentifying with people. You think of, for example, race or caste, which can be very evil ways of disidentifying, but not necessarily. I mean, family identifications tend on the whole to be rather benevolent. Somebody belongs to another family, well, they just don't come to our birthdays or to our marriages, but that is about all. There is one very important expression about benevolent disidentifications. They're called relations de plaisanterie, joking relationships. As a matter of fact, before the catastrophe in Rwanda, which I studied to learn more about identifications and disidentifications, Hutu and Tutsi was mostly a joking subject in the village. And people would drink together and curse the tax authorities in the city, and they were just Hutu Tutsi peasants making jokes about their differences and similarity. So it does not need to be toxic, it can, but there is always exclusivity. There are always more or less flexible boundaries. And that is what so I'm not Carl Schmitt who says you need an enemy to survive. But in Europe, and the attempt to create a feeling of being European, there was too much an accent of it being open towards the world, of inviting everybody, of being open and welcoming of everybody, which I strongly support, but which may stand in the way of creating identifications on the basis of what we share and what... and I think because of this, what I call UNESCO idealism, this strong partisanship for the morally good against the morally bad, the right-wing parties in Europe got an opportunity to score. And they accept, some people don't belong here. Some people should never come here. Some people should be kicked out. But part of that was that they were filling in the shadowy side of the concept of identity and maybe, say, the exclusionary side of processes of identification and disidentification. Brexit, in this respect, is a tremendously interesting episode in the development of the European Union, because to my total astonishment, the 27 other member countries stick together, and they keep their fist on the table. And it's very difficult to get any light to shine between their several opinions. But for the first time, they have an opponent. An opponent they dare fight. And I think it is very visible how opposition creates a stronger unity, a stronger identification between, in this case, nations. But it is not necessary that identifications are hostile. They can be sometimes very benevolent and even creative. Now, this concept of identification is going to the expression widening circles of identification. That, as a matter of fact, was the title of the piece I did on Rwanda. And I have to go through it very briefly. But probably, at the dawn of humanity, human beings lived in very small hunting and gathering bands, and their identifications comprised maybe 100 people whom they all knew personally, who were close kin, and probably the next tribe was, these people were very different. They eat blueberries, we only eat blackberries. People who eat blueberries are basically unclean, I should tell you that. You can imagine a whole system of identifications at that level. And then you can dream on and talk about villages, peasant villages as units of political structure and identifications. And you can talk about towns and kingdoms. And finally, one of the greatest identificatory constructions in world history, nation states. And they still are. They command tremendous loyalty. People say they are willing to die for their nation. What they mean is they're willing to kill for their nation and take the collateral risk of dying. You should decode this. So at present, almost the entire surface of the earth is covered by nation states. And within those nation states, there are all sorts of different identifications with your golf club, or with your political party, or with your family. There are many, and all these identifications have to be done and done all over, and we must cement those bonds by parties and by symbols and by ways of talking, or by having a group photograph as a first attempt to establish a sort of identificatory links. Watch the symbolism of these meetings to see how we try to build out of the atoms of the students something of an academic community. Now, as I indicated, such networks of identifications which are changing, multiple, sometimes most of the time contradictory, overlapping, are part of the social process of cultural, linguistic, and political integration, which in the past 10,000 years has gone from units of, say, 100 to units of, say, 100 million, and those giants comprise like 200, 400 million, even over 1 billion people, China and India. So there has been an enormous extension of the scale of identifications and their corollary disidentifications. So it's, you could say, part of history. It's not easy to strengthen, let alone manage. But let's look at a very special kind of people, whom you could call public symbolic operators. What the hell is that? It's intellectuals, writers, authors, poets, usually people who manipulate the word, but sometimes also people who manipulate the image. Let's think of the court painters in Spain, whose images are immediately associated with nation building and with the power of the court. So artists sometimes are included. And of course politicians, whose job it is to appeal on one string of emotional identification or pluck another string of hostile feeling and rejection of other people. They are the musicians of the souls of their followers. Now you could ask, what are the opportunities that those symbolic operators, intellectuals, let's call them public intellectuals, can use to further their aims? Because they operate in a cultural and political opportunity structure. And if you leave this place, if only you would remember the idea of a cultural opportunity structure, I would be satisfied. That would be enough. I took the term from Creasy, a Swiss political scientist who coined the term political opportunity structure to explain why social movements emerge and sometimes even succeed in certain conditions and not in others. And I thought that's a very clever term, and I used it to coin the term cultural opportunity structure. So in what, probably naive people would call it the system. What is the environment you're operating in as a public intellectual? Well, there are very few intellectuals in Europe who are also intellectuals of Europe. Every nation has its outstanding thinkers, philosophers, writers, poets, artists, but very few symbolic operators who are tied to the word, to the language, can transcend the barriers of language in Europe, and very few can transcend national boundaries. I'm trying to think of voices that were heard all across Europe. At the time, for example, Kundera, the Czech writer who decided to write in French. I'm thinking of Günter Grass, maybe. Umberto Eco, who usually spoke in English when he performed in that role. Let's think, can you come up with names with voices who are heard across boundaries of language and across national boundaries in the European Union? Think of it. I have a hard time thinking of it. The famous French public intellectuals are not taken very seriously out of France, but they certainly give it a hard try. And Todorov. Todorov probably is one of the very good candidates. He spoke, Tsvetan Todorov, who was a member of this academy, spoke, certainly in Southern Europe, he was a voice that was heard across Spain, France. So Todorov would be a good choice. My favorite member of the academy, Bronisław Geremek, the Polish historian who wrote mostly in French. Who's your favorite European intellectual? Ian Buruma? My heart skips a beat. I admire him so much that I can just about repress my envy. Okay, let's think about it, because it's very important. because you want to be, you're interested in becoming cultural entrepreneurs in a so far not entirely existent entity, which is called the European Union. And you want to become transnational entrepreneurs. And here we have a little transnational enterprise, which of course speaks English. And when it speaks Spanish, little things go to the ear. One gesture symbolizing boundaries. Well, when you look, how could someone pick a career as a public intellectual? Who'd pay your salary? Intellectuals generally are based, let's see, in universities, newspapers, some other media, but that's about it. And all those institutions that pay an intellectual's salary are strongly nationally grounded. Universities, media. What else can you do? The administration, the institutions of the state. So there is simply no material base for operating as a transnational intellectual. But then in what language would you express yourself? It's not always easy to be translated, it's quite costly. And how would you capture the interest of the other nations you want to speak to? So if you would do, say, a materialist analysis of public intellectuals, you would see that they are gebunden an der Scholle, they're tied to the soil, like Russian serfs in the 19th century. Gravity is pulling people back from a supranational existence into a national existence. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit on purpose. For example, in popular arts or in music, people can have transnational careers. Dutch DJs travel in private jets all across the world doing their Dutch DJ thing. But it's music, and if they utter only a single sound, wow, it's an English cry. Wow, it's English, it's not Spanish. How do you do wow in Spanish? You say wow, under strong imperialist American influence. It gets deep into your... But there are, of course, myriads of European niche. And Yuste is exactly what you could call a little European niche. And you would have to interview the board of, and the people of the Yuste Academy to see how they try to eke out a living, to what institutions they go for grants, and because they have a very good idea of the small arteries that feed these little niches of transnational European institutions. It's also very interesting, and I won't do it, to sum up which media transcend borders. And then you come to see that very few language-bound media transgress borders, and those are almost exclusively Anglophone. And they're all elitist. Let me say, the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal. So that maybe not more than 5. There was an attempt in the beginning of the century by the English publisher Robert Maxwell to create The Independent, was going to be an all-European journal. It was the European. It failed miserably and cost him zillions of pounds. But the question why is not all that clear. There are a number of European news stations, Euronews, but most of them are devoted to sports. Now, here you will get de Swaan's 21st law. The more specialized a network is in its subject, like, say, health risks to plumbers, that's very specialized, the easier it is to form an all-European transnational network, because the focus is on one subject, people are highly motivated to find out. The language tends to be highly technical and more easily transferred. And the broader the subject for on the agenda is, the harder it is to mobilize transnational networks. And precisely these sort of encounters on Europe, Europe, what's next? Or the future of democracy in the West. I mean, those real intellectual topics. They are the hardest to create. There are a couple of thousand European journals on very highly specialized topics. There are very few European journals that transcend borders on broad topics. And most of them are a history of failure. For example, Libère by Pierre Bourdieu, which was a very ambitious attempt to do precisely that, or an attempt which Steve and I were involved in creating a network of small intellectual journals, and even a digest that would publish from all those journals in reviews in all different languages, the best in English, of course. Most of them are histories of failure. So the very important function of public intellectuals in raising issues, in touching upon subjects and rephrasing and redefining issues so that a new vocabulary for mutual identification emerges, operates in a structure of very low cultural opportunities. Fragmentation of European public space has enormously increased by the introduction of social media, which are very hard to open up to one and the same audience. When, for example, the king or the president speaks at the opening of the parliamentary year, all newspapers will carry that speech and comment upon it. It sets a national agenda. But in social media, there is no agenda. Things emerge, spread across networks, sometimes go viral, which means that they go from network to network to network, creating super and hyper networks into the millions and hundreds of millions of scores. But there is no common agenda among people who use social media. There are thousands of highly fragmented agendas. And since this is very recent, I started working on this topic about 20 years ago, and then that's exactly the time social media have come up, and it's still very hard to gauge what exactly is the effect of social media, fragmented to the smallest networks, on a general public space and on a common public agenda. Television in the second half of the 20th century played an enormous role in creating such common agendas. And before that, radio did. And of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler were the absolute masters of radio as a medium, and of using it to create one common public space and manipulating it. They are similar in this respect, but I have my sympathies, and so do you. Television, for some reason, it did create a very unified public space, but I do not know people who rose through TV as Hitler and Roosevelt did through radio. And now we have a genius of social media. This may be the only respect he's a genius in, but obviously Donald Trump has a fantastic gift of doing exactly that, manipulating words and symbols in creating a common agenda through social media. First of all, I think he has 40 million followers, which helps. But secondly, every little fart he lets go there is immediately magnified by every other medium. And if he says about Rosenstein, he's bad, he's a bad man, immediately the national discussion is about the moral character of Rosenstein, the adjunct Attorney General, the Minister of Justice. All right, I'll leave it at that. Let me end with a little prediction I made. That's quite a long time ago, I think I did that. Barring major disasters and wars, the most probable way for a European sphere of publics to take shape is in the course of a fundamental conflict throughout the European Union. Not only similar and synchronous, but this time interconnected across borders. In my opinion, Europe, the European Union, enormously profits from Brexit. Not in a financial, not in a strictly political way, but for the first time, we're having a go at a real opponent. Let's have it. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Abram, for this deep analysis on how we feel, on how you feel European identity through these three concepts you went through on public space, identity, and culture, opportunity, structure. Well, I should say that I know Abram from a long time ago, and he's always a little bit provocative, as you have been here. And well, you mentioned a lot of the topic of languages, and I know you are one of the experts in these topics. I always remember your famous sentence of the more multilingualism, the more English we will have.
The more languages, the more English.
Yeah, the more languages, the more English. And of course, in this case, at least for me, you leave me a little bit worried, because you painted a panorama which is quite, in some way, could be some pessimistic, because at the end it's a question of connections between people. It's my very summary analysis of what you say, but it's the concept I got. It's a question of connections. And it's a problem of how this project we build up all together is really connecting people. I still remember that, that slogan of a famous telephone brand that says it's about connecting people. And it looks like right now, social networks that are done and smartphones that are done to connect people are disconnecting people. How do you see that in our society? How do you feel that this could help us to build up the European Union stronger? Or maybe we are going in a different direction? In one of these forums, just to finish with my reflection and question, we also talk about more a global union, more than European Union. And some people is fighting also for that, because maybe the new technologies allow that. But these are disconnecting people. The more we use these tools to connect people, the more disconnected we are with the reality. How do you see that? Do you want to answer from there? Maybe it's much better.
This is such a difficult question, I cannot answer it standing up. I, for one, do not know what the impact of social media will be. Although my first impression after, say, the 5 or 10 years that they're really expanding very quickly, is that they make for first of all, almost everybody is a member of different networks and of different circles and of multiple different circles. But it does make for great fragmentation. It also makes it very hard to control the validity of a message and the authenticity of a message. What it does to the state of public debates and the level of information of the electorate, I'm not quite sure. We should remember that from the late 19th century until the late 20th century, you had the yellow press, the popular press, which in misleading and lying and exaggerating and propagating certainly is not outdone by the social media. And they were an actual danger to democratic politics, and were considered that way. So far we have survived with a few wounds there. So it's very difficult to say what will grow out of this. It may be that some voices will emerge from these social media, not just as temporary Twitter celebrities, but as lasting voices of import and impact on a very large audience. So far, I have not seen that. But one person, Donald Trump, does a very impressive job of keeping everybody's ears pricked up. When people want to know what stupidity he will utter now.
Okay, thank you very much. It's the time to open the floor for questions, comments. So, how do you feel about this? Here we have, you present yourself, you rise, please stand up. You say who you are and you...
Soy Miguel Encabo, profesor de la Universidad de Extremadura.
¿Se oye bien?
Bien, sí. I would like to speak in English because...
Yes, of course, we speak in English.
Normally, no, but I can translate to Spanish, okay. I'm interested about the emotions about Europe. So that's the reason why I like what you say about the artists. So the artist can compose a new Europe, but that could be from the heart, not from the top of the politics statement. So that is my opinion, but and I agree with you that you have to say about the psychologic theories and sociology too. That is a good question. Can you do you think that the artist could be the future or not? I believe that the artist could be the future of Europe, emotions. Thank you.
Well, I'll try to answer the question by taking an example which all of you know, Guernica by Pablo Picasso. Guernica is a tremendously emotional outburst. It can hardly be more expressive in art than Guernica. But when you look at the pictures taken while Picasso was working on it, he was as clever and as thinking and as calculating and manipulating to create the maximum emotional impact possible. So that's my first point. A good artist is also a very good technician and a very clever demagogue. But when the piece is finished, you don't see that. You feel your heart skip a beat. But that's his craft. It's not just that he was angry about Guernica, he just happened to be one of the best media specialists of his time. The second thing is that, yes, it went viral, we would say today. So did his dove, a little blue dove. Partly because he was part of an artistic public space. Many, many people were interested in the arts, knew about him. Many people knew about him because he was proverbial for making the kind of art my 3-year-old daughter could also make, but that still made him into a household word. He was also part of the Communist International. I don't know if he was a card-carrying member, but communist and left socialist, whoever fought Franco, was interested in what Picasso had to express. So we could study him as an example of the artist, the creative artist, as a political operator who was part of very interesting public spaces that did indeed transcend European borders, and even he was very much followed in the Soviet Union.
We have another question over here. The one over there. Yeah, no, you go.
My name is Berta Corridor, I'm a journalist, and I work for several media in Belgium, like International United Voices for Peace, International Yehudi-Menuhin Foundation. So the idea you gave about culture, it was a very pessimistic one, I think, well, everyone knows, and very related with the elite. So my question is, how do we approach public with culture? How do we do in Europe to do that? Which are our tools to make people participate in the culture? With festivals, or what can we do for that?
Yeah, let me try to think. Well, first to come back to the word elite, I don't think you go from Congress to Congress in your Maserati. You leave that to your driver. Meaning we don't belong to a financial elite or to a political elite. But we certainly feel we are part of a cultural, we call it network, which is open to everybody, but somebody who doesn't know who Picasso was, it's a little bit difficult. So even if we perceive ourselves as very open and very democratic and very welcoming and inclusive, other people may look at us, suddenly we're an us, as a jet set or and feel an envy and a sense of exclusion. And you don't usually perceive that yourself, but other people, so that is important. I just did a little work on NGOs that subsidize in Africa and Asia women's issues. And almost everywhere, they are almost completely neutralized by the fact that they're from the West. And they themselves don't perceive it that way. But the imams and the ayatollahs do. And they can be completely frustrated. So that is one point. Then you ask, what can we do to contribute to a more integrated European public space of culture? It's not up to me to tell you, but watch the environment you're operating in. Realize that it is not very very supportive of transnational initiatives, and look at the material conditions. The material conditions that underpin, for example, a colloquium like this one. Where did they get the money? Who do they know? What kind of academic titles do they mobilize to open a door for them? It's work. And usually we don't talk about, we're here and we're in a festive mood, but some guys who exactly know how to do this, transnational European cultural operators, can tell us a lot. We maybe should have a session, how did we finance this session? It's a very material thing, but the material thing uses symbols and authority and reputation. Reputational work. Think of all the titles that have been thrown around here in the first 5 minutes to show that we're not from the street, we're not from a back alley. We're important European people. So that opens doors, but it also creates resentment.
Sí, allá atrás. Sí, te presentas, dices de dónde vienes y disparas.
Hi, good morning. My name is Serena. I'm a fourth-year international relations student coming from Madrid. And first of all, thank you very much for your conference. And I would like to know, in your opinion, which are the possible ways or means to engage most of the population and the majority of the population for them to feel they are part of Europe? Because most of the times I hear that it's very easy to do it with the young part of the population, because it's very easy to use social media with us because we are young, but not everyone is 21 like me. And I would like to know, in your opinion, which are the best ways to make the rest of the population, for instance, my family or people who are like 50 or 60 years old, to make them feel they're part of the European Union, not just for them to think that, okay, I have my ID, my passport and my rights, but for them to feel that they are really part of something important. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to ask a counter question. To what degree, in what sense are they really part of Europe? You would have to ask, what is their life like, and in what why should they identify with Europe and Europeans? One thing is, let me point out one little mechanism. Europe has tremendously large agricultural and structural subsidies. A good part of Extremadura has been renovated with European subsidies. The same goes for, say, Poland. But in many countries, and if I'm well informed, Poland is one of them, the national government sort of glosses over the fact that this is European money. So a very simple thing is somehow point out, look, the bridge you're driving over every day was financed by the European Union. Those are, again, very humble, but the question is, how are people related to Europe, if at all? Or is it just an abstraction and a pipe dream and something good to say on a sunny morning in Quacos de Yuste? We're very pious people.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor? Okay, so we have a couple of minutes. I will finish with one. As you know, and we are approaching European elections. Something that really bothers me a lot is that we are still questioning about the existence of a European Union rather than discussing on topics that are affecting us. So we are not talking about politics at European level. We are talking still about should Europe exist or not. How do you see that in the following months, especially knowing that we will have elections in May? And because it could be dramatic that if there is not a lot of participation, people will think that Europe is not well valued anymore.
I wanted to, yes. On the other hand, there is also a discussion in this country whether Spain should exist in its present form. Mm-hmm. Sometimes fundamental givens are discussed again. The same happens in Great Britain, where the existence of the United Kingdom has been debated hotly 2 years ago with the Scottish referendum. And if we could point out the reasons for existence for Europe, why should Spanish people care? One little perverse effect of the existence of the European Union is that Scotland and Catalonia had the idea that they could become little member states of the Union, something between Malta and Cyprus. No, I'm being unkind. So it felt as an encouragement. At the same time, they didn't get one bit of support, neither from the Union itself, which is not going to disavow its own member states, nor from the individual member states, because almost each member state has a limb that wants to walk on its own. Like we have Frisia, the Belgians have much more serious Flanders. So it had this existence of the European Union has encouraged succession from member states. What should we do to make people feel more European, to identify more with other Europeans? Well, paradoxically enough, the nationalist authoritarian right has found a way. They say, we are Judeo-Christian people. I love the little Judeo because their fathers were very anti-Judeo. So, okay, we are anti-Judeo-Christian people with roots going far back into Christian, Latin and Greek civilization in antiquity. And therefore you don't belong here. I'm pointing above your heads. Which is a very strange conclusion. Since we are, the first one, I wasn't aware that they were so Christian or so interested in antiquity, but they mobilized this as a very potent argument to exclude, well, this means exclude people of Islamic faith, or maybe African people. But you should grant it to them. Mm-hmm. They know what they're doing, and they use it not as a weapon for the Union, but against it. I think they would be content with a much more closed, much more exclusionary European Union that would be acceptable to them on the grounds of this rather mythological common heritage. But some people know very well what they're doing, and we could maybe learn from them by studying the perversions and trying to turn their techniques in favor of a more inclusive and democratic union. By the way, the authoritarian right learned all the lessons of the rebellious, gauchiste, leftist, left-wing generation. There's a book by Alice Nigel in which he shows how rightist extremists in the social media took almost all their cues from a few generations before leftist politics.
So thank you very much, Abram. So that's it. I think it was a very interesting opening lecture, and we thank you very much for your words and for sharing this moment with us, with a big clap, of course.